We're very pleased tonight to have Chris Hughes here. You won't get an argument from Chris over the proposition that some people in life just are luckier than the rest of us. Chris has certainly been among the most lucky. He grew up in a small town in North Carolina in a family of modest means, but on scholarship he was able to attend a very fancy boarding school in New England, and then Harvard, where he ended up rooming with Mark Zuckerberg and became one of the co-founders of Facebook. Early on, Chris ran Facebook's communications and marketing department, then cashed out his share after a few years for nearly $500 million. As he puts it in his new book, he did 3 years' worth of work for nearly $500 million. The book, Fair Shot, is in part a memoir. Chris chronicles how after Facebook, he spent time managing an online system that organized support for Barack Obama during Obama's first presidential campaign. Then he suffered his first major career failure. In 2012, he bought the New Republic and was initially applauded as a seeming savior of the financially beleaguered magazine, but he left 4 years later after much staff turmoil and with the publication still in debt. In 2012, he co-founded the Economic Security Project, an initiative that's exploring the idea of a guaranteed basic income for many less advantaged Americans, recognizing that chance is a factor in what keeps many others poor. Chris argues in his book that the best approach to reducing poverty and enlarging the middle class would be to provide a guaranteed income for the working poor, paid for by the most wealthy. Obviously, such a redistribution of wealth proposal is quite controversial, but Chris contends it's the right thing to do. Our country can afford it, and experience has shown that a range of positive effects can result from cash grants to those in need. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Chris Hughes. Great to have you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and for all of you guys for coming out here. This is actually my first time at the Wharf location of Politics and Prose as well, and I live in New York. I've not actually been down to the Wharf. It seems pretty amazing, but thank you for opening up this space and creating an opportunity for me to get a chance to chat with all of you guys. So I'm going to give a little bit of a talk, read a little bit from the book, and then we're going to open it up for not just questions, but hopefully a robust conversation, because the more this really can be structured as a conversation, I think the stronger it'll be. To start off, I want to tell you a story about a trip that I took to Ohio last summer. I was headed to Youngstown, which is just an hour's drive outside of Cleveland, and that in turn is just an hour and a half of a flight from my home in New York City, but it's much further than such a short plane ride would suggest. Now, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm no stranger to small town America. I grew up in Hickory, North Carolina, which is a little town in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. My mom was a public school teacher. My dad was a traveling paper salesman. And, I sometimes joke that they raised me to be politically conservative, religious, and straight. And I ended up none of the three. And now that I'm a parent of a 2-month-old, I'm learning the hard way that the best intentions don't always bring exactly what you hope. But that's how it works sometimes, I guess. But about halfway through this trip in Ohio, I found myself sitting in a circle in a community center just outside of Cleveland with about 20 different people. And we were there to talk about how the changing economy had affected the future of work. This is the kind of conversation that we have oftentimes in a lot of different contexts, but it's so rare that at least for people like myself, that we have the opportunity to go to a place like Ohio, where manufacturing used to be one of the most common job providers, and where that has changed. And so we started the conversation just with a sort of an obvious kind of question. Just say your name and what you do. What you do for a living. Or if you don't have work, what you most recently did. And as we went around the circle, there was somebody who was a house cleaner, somebody else who worked part-time at JCPenney. There were a couple others who were working 2 jobs in fast food, not 40 hours and 40 hours, but they could get 15 hours from one Burger King and another 15 from another spot. And there were still some other people who were handymen or in seasonal work. But by the time we had gone around the whole circle, a somewhat obvious thing became apparent, not just to me, but to my colleagues and to the other people there. Everybody in that group technically had work, but none of them had the security of full-time employment. Almost none of the jobs that the folks who came out that day had offered the security of 40 hours a week. Few of them provided any kind of benefits, or vacation days or paid sick leave. And you can forget about a retirement account. And what I heard that day is increasingly in line with what the statistics in America show. A job used to mean stability. That was synonymous. But for now, for much of America, a job increasingly just means yet another gig. And so after about an hour of conversation, I asked a question that a lot of people frankly, in rooms like this one, in New York and Washington and San Francisco, ask me. A lot of people assume that modest amounts of cash won't make that much of a real dent in the lives of a lot of working people. So I posed a question to the group. What difference would an extra $100 a month make in your lives? And it had been a pretty affable conversation up until that point. People were pretty relaxed. We'd all sort of gotten to know each other. After I asked that question, stone silent. Nobody said a word. Until one woman, an African-American woman in her late 30s, looked up and she locked eyes with me and she said, frankly, anybody who's asking that question has never had to choose at the end of the month between making rent and buying groceries. She didn't say another word. No one else did. Didn't have to. We live in an America where a lot of smart people think a lot about what the future might hold. They talk about when self-driving cars might come, when the robots might rise to take all of the jobs. But I have a message for all of the futurists out there. The future is already here, and jobs have come apart in America. We all know some of the stats, but it's worthwhile just to take 3 or 4 key ones as a whole, because I think they paint the picture. In the past decade, according to Princeton economists, all of the jobs, 94% of all of the jobs that have been created have been part-time, contract, or temporary. 0.1% of Americans, not the top 1%, 0.1% of Americans now own as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. Median wages have not meaningfully budged in 40 years, and income inequality hasn't been this bad since the year 1929, which history buffs in the crowd will remember as the year that the Great Depression began. Now, some of you may be wondering, who's this guy to sit up there and talk to us about income inequality? What does he know about it? Well, I think that I'm Exhibit A of the unfairness that is driving much of the American economy today. And I want to tell you why. About 14 years ago, I had one of the most monumental conversations of my own life, and I didn't really know it at the time. I was a sophomore at Harvard, and I was working in, I was about 20 years old, and I was working in a job that paid $10 an hour, sitting in a library called John Hick's House. That was a small little library at the front desk, in theory, checking the IDs of students as they came and went, and checking out books in case someone needed them. That particular night, I'd been chatting online with my roommate, Mark Zuckerberg, and things had started getting somewhat heated. A couple months before, we had released the Facebook.com, as it was called then, and it had exploded in popularity. Mark was struggling to keep the site up with an unexpected flood of users, while at the same time coding for an imminent expansion. We were already at 6,000 students at Harvard, and so the next colleges were going to be Yale and Dartmouth and Stanford. So he was coding to bring those schools online, and at the same time tutoring our third roommate, Dustin, who didn't know anything to start about computer programming in the fundamentals, so that he would be able to assist in the build-out. I was handling all of the human sort of non-coder work, which was marketing, communications, and early product development. But it was clear at this point that Facebook was becoming a real thing. Not only were college kids using it, but we were about to expand, and there was a chance that it could become a real business. We were incorporating it. And Mark and I were chatting online about my ownership stake. Mark needed to head to the Science Center, so I met him under the portico of the dorm to continue the conversation. And that night we took a fateful walk in the rain. I just want to read a few paragraphs from the book. "I want 10%, I said as we walked. I wasn't sure, honestly, if he'd heard me the first time. The rain pounded onto the umbrella I was awkwardly holding over the two of us. So I said it again. This time it came out sounding more like a demand. I want 10%. The number felt a little ambitious, but not entirely unreasonable. I'd brushed up on the rudiments of effective bargaining and decided that it was better to start high. I just don't really think you've earned that much, Mark answered. I paused and took a little time to respond, thinking to myself, this might matter someday. I appreciate what you're doing, Mark continued, and I think you could do a lot more as we grow the site, but I need to keep control, and the others need fair equity too. The rain turned into a downpour and our steps quickened. This was the worst way to have such an important conversation, but our suite wouldn't have been much better. Mark and I shared a cramped bedroom that barely fit our two twin beds. Dustin shared a similarly small bedroom with our fourth roommate, Billy, who'd chosen not to participate in anything Facebook-related. Our common room had just enough space for our 4 desks and a small futon. There was little room for in-person, private conversations, let alone a business conversation that might turn into an argument. As Mark and I walked up Holyoke Street and entered Harvard Yard, I argued that carefully communicating the story of Facebook was critical to its virality and to securing our users' trust. People are signing up because the site is good, and it's good because they know us and they can trust us, I said. We're not an anonymous internet company, we're their peers. Mark agreed and even nodded, but he didn't move any closer to my number. By the steps of Widener Library in the center of Harvard Yard, I caved. Just give me whatever you think is fair. I know it's hard to balance all of us. Frustrated, tired, and late to whatever meeting he was going to, Mark replied with a simple, okay, and walked off, no umbrella, no hoodie, directly into the pouring rain. A few weeks later, I found out that Mark had given me around 2% of equity in the company, and that Dustin had gotten several times more. Mark, of course, had retained control for himself. That made that conversation at once an epic failure of negotiation, and in many ways the most successful conversation of my life. That 2% of equity in the company, 8 years later, That little sliver ended up being worth nearly $500 million. I worked for 3 more years to earn it, but there is nothing else to call this, ladies and gentlemen, than a lucky break. But the word luck doesn't fully capture exactly what happened there. The reason is because it makes it sound like I just sort of won the lottery, right? Like that I just happened to be there and it was in the right place in the right time, which is true. However, we have created an economy. We've engineered an economy where a small group of people are recurringly winning the lottery, where a select few are consistently getting super rich while many more are left behind. My case may be extreme, but unfortunately, it is much more common than you might think. In the book, I make the case that America created this winner-take-all economy beginning in the late 1970s, leading up through the 1980s, and it's continued until today. Automation, globalization, the rise of finance, all forces that our political leaders have supported, have buoyed the fortunes of corporations and have made it possible to create so much wealth for so few overnight. This is historically without precedent. The idea of 20-year-olds coming in to this amount of money, the only precedent for it is royalty or in cases of massive inheritance. It is without precedent in our history. And it is because we have created an economy that makes it possible for not just for a small number of people to win, but to create a winner-take-all economy. The trickle-down economic worldview has been good for America's corporations, but it's not good for Americans. And just because economists tell us that the economy is healthy again, unemployment is at record lows and the stock market is at record highs, we know that the lived experience of Americans is that the American dream is not strong. In fact, there's every reason to believe that it is fundamentally at risk. But there is good news. We built this economy, and we can change it too. And if there's only one thing that you take away from the whole talk tonight, whether you end up deciding to check out the book or not, please let it be this. Sometimes the best solution is the simplest. We can use cash, cold hard money, to provide a guaranteed income that boosts the bottom lines of working Americans and reinvigorates the American dream. Here's how. 3 points. Number 1, invest in what works. The single most successful program to encourage economic mobility in the United States, in my view, has a wonky name that belies its power. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And not a lot of people know about it, but it's actually the largest cash transfer program in the world. 30 million Americans get anywhere between $500 and $6,000 each year to supplement their earnings, no strings attached. It's called a tax credit, but the lived experience of this for the majority of the recipients is a check that comes from the federal government a month or two after you filed your returns that you can use in whatever way you choose. And we know it works. Recipients work just as much after they receive that check as they do before. I'll just repeat that one more time because this is one of the biggest concerns when people talk about the guaranteed income. After recipients get an influx of cash, they work just as much after they get that as they do before. We see the same evidence corroborated up in Alaska, where they have a small guaranteed income, and internationally. In addition, their kids do better in school, they do better on tests, and they stay in school longer or more likely to go to college. And everyone in the family is healthier, not to mention a little bit less stressed. So rather than starting some brand new program out of whole cloth, my view is let's invest in what works. Number 2, to do this, I think we should expand and modernize the Earned Income Tax Credit to provide $500 every month, just like clockwork, to everybody in America who makes less than $50,000. This money will arrive like clockwork via direct deposit or via debit card to address the instability so many families experience. And this is a key point. It's not just the income inequality that I think it's critical to combat. It's the income instability, which is only growing more problematic as the gig economy and the part-time and contract work that it symbolizes grow. So a $500 in the background every single month that arrives like clockwork would provide fundamental financial stability at the same time as working to combat income inequality. A family with 2 parents who work in minimum wage jobs, just to give you a sense of the scale of this, would see a boost to their incomes overnight of 40%. Anyone who works would get the money. And when I use the word work, I mean a broad and expanded definition of work. My politics are firmly here on the left. I'm not interested in cynical uses of work requirements to throw people off of government benefits. What I'm interested in is expanding the definition of work that is currently used by the Earned Income Tax Credit to include the work that nearly 30 million Americans are already doing in things like childcare, elder care, and education and study. Historically, we have not recognized these activities as the work that I think that they are, and it's time that we expand the definition to recognize them as the work that they are and ensure that Americans who are doing it have the financial stability that they deserve. Thirdly, we should pay for it by bringing tax rates on people like me into line with their historical averages, up to 50% on income above $250,000, and closing some of the most egregious tax loopholes. This is not about pitchforks coming for the rich. I believe it's about what we owe one another. Nor is this policy a kind of silver bullet. We still need good schools, better health care, and smart climate policy. But it is the most powerful and immediate thing that we can do to combat income inequality and give everyone a fair shot. It would provide financial security to 90 million Americans who are struggling to make ends meet, and overnight lift 20 million people out of poverty. But perhaps most importantly, the guaranteed income would allow people to chase their own dreams on their own terms. It would respect the fundamental dignity that every citizen in America has and provide them with a little bit more freedom to figure out what they want and who they want to be. This idea has been written about by philosophers and political organizers going back centuries to Thomas Paine, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others. But in this moment, I think it was critical. I think it's impossible to overstate the auspiciousness of the moment that we live in and the importance that there is that we owe it to one another to think big. We cannot let the defensive crouch in our current politics prevent us from imagining and working toward a more stable and economically just future. Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions of all sorts. And I would encourage, if there are skeptics out there who are like, I don't know if that math exactly adds up, or what did you mean about that one thing, to please speak up. And I'm also happy to talk about a whole range of things. I love talking about the book and the guaranteed income, et cetera, but you know, there are so many things happening in our world, and I've had experience at Facebook, at New Republic, with President Obama. You know, we can have the conversation, really take it where it goes. So I do know that for those of you who have questions, I do know that they hope that you will step up to the microphone, given that this is being videoed, recorded. So please.
I guess I'm the guinea pig here.
Looks that way.
So I was hoping you might also talk a bit about the politics of this.
Happily.
We just had an extraordinary tax bill pass the Congress. It is incredibly regressive. A decade from now, 83% of the benefits in that tax bill will go to the richest 1%. And over half the people actually at that time will be paying higher taxes because of that bill. So obviously we've got a very regressive context. So, you know, the difficulties that you're describing, we also face with respect to some of the key benefit programs, Medicaid, food stamps, housing. So talk a little bit about what you perceive the politics need to be with respect to moving in the direction that you espouse.
So a few things. I think many thoughts. I think that coming out of the 2016 election, the message that so many of us heard was that folks on the left and right agreed that the economic system was rigged against them. That there was a message that, you know, that despite the economic growth, because it was not fairly distributed, it was time for some kind of structural change. Now, I guess it shouldn't be that surprising that the result of that was the tax bill that was passed at the end of last year, which to me is infuriating and perplexing. I mean, history has so carefully shown that trickle-down economics do not work for the American people. They might work for corporations, but I mean, how much more? We have 40 years of economic evidence that shows quite clearly that if you want to stimulate growth and provide for broad-based economic prosperity, that is not the way to do it. Yet, that's the tax bill that we got passed. I think that the silver lining or the opportunity, in my view, is to begin work organizing primarily in states now around the idea of a modernized, expanded earned income tax credit, to build towards a moment when we can repeal and replace what was just passed, and in so doing, do it in a way that puts a modernized earned income tax credit at the center of a new kind of tax bill. You know, a lot of people talk about, okay, guaranteed income, you know, that sounds great, but that's never going to happen. I mean, first off, it's just way too expensive. The rough cost of what I'm outlining in Fair Shot in the book over the next decade is more or less the cost that the Republican tax bill just added to the deficit. So anybody who says that this idea is just too big and it's just too expensive, well, if that tax bill and the tax cut on the corporations and the top 1% isn't too big for them on the right, then I do not believe this kind of idea should be too big for those of us on the left. So in terms of the politics of how to get this done, I do think that there is some opportunity for not just a kind of left progressive case to be made, but one that really encompasses the center as well. And what gives me hope on that count is that the earned income tax credit has historically been extremely popular on the left and on the right. It was signed into law by Gerald Ford in 1975, and every single president, every single one since him, Republican and Democrat alike, has meaningfully expanded the benefit. So there's good, and the reason is because there's evidence that shows that it is incredibly powerful. I mean, the EITC lifts more people out of poverty already than food stamps, housing vouchers, and unemployment insurance combined. So there's a sense that this is a very powerful way to provide economic mobility on the left and the right. And, you know, one little anecdote that just happened to me last week, I was on one of these financial television shows, and I had been talking a little bit about the idea on CNBC. I had been talking about the guaranteed income idea for a little bit, and so they had to bring on somebody, in theory, to oppose it. And so they brought on the former CEA chair under George W. Bush, and the host teed it up, and he was like, what do you think about this idea of a guaranteed income? Oh, that's a horrible idea. Americans want to work. Nobody wants a handout, et cetera, et cetera. And then I said, well, what do you think about modernizing the earned income tax credit to make it bigger and flat and encompass a broader net of people? Well, that's a great idea. I mean, there's a clip. I mean, we put it on our website. I mean, it was like night and day. And so I think the challenge for many of us who believe in the values behind a guaranteed income, and in the sense that cash does respect dignity and does provide a little bit more freedom, our challenge is to really build a bridge between that language and some of the less sexy but incredibly important policy avenues to get this done, and do it in a way that tries to build as broad a consensus as is possible. Is it still very ambitious, going to be very difficult, and a long road? Absolutely, but I also think we have to start somewhere.
Hey, Chris. Mike Tidwell with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and we're actually working on a bill here in the district to put a price on carbon to create part of this rebate to create income for folks. First of all, this is a fantastic book. I don't know how many of you read it. It just came out, but it's really great. We were both inspired in part by Peter Barnes, a great West Coast entrepreneur, founder of Credo Mobile Long Distance, who talked a lot about fairness and rebates for folks. But what I found really great about this book, and I'd like to ask you your process, is the power of telling your personal story. Weaving these complex, wonky economic ideas with a beautiful, literally unput-downable book. I mean, I couldn't stop reading. I started reading on a rainy Saturday afternoon this past weekend. But just the power of the personal storytelling. Talk about how you approach that, and what was that writing process like for you? And if you're interested in being involved in the DC carbon tax campaign, I happen to have these green postcards.
I love it. It was really intense. It was, I think one of the biggest challenges was trying to figure out how much of myself to put out there, to be totally honest. I mean, I've had a career where people have said all kinds of crazy positive things about me, and other moments when they've said somewhat negative things about me, and so I've been I've a lot of the time been a little reticent, I'd say, but I started writing and I was enjoying it, and I also felt like my own story, I mean, it is what it is, and the more that I could tell that, I think the better that I would feel, because it would, I think cast frankly, the absurdity of my own situation in a more accurate light, and also, hopefully be a conversation starter for other people. And I do really love, one of my colleagues from the Economic Security Project is here. I do really love research reports, empirical analysis. I can do models with the earned income tax credit. Like, I just love this stuff. And so the risk was to go too far in the wonk direction. And so I really sort of challenged myself to explore why I was doing this. Why do I do this all day, every day in the first place? And so the more that I did that, the better it felt. And so the book, for those of you who haven't read it, does begin more so with my personal story. What was it like growing up in North Carolina? My dad had grown up the son of a groundskeeper on a golf course, and my mom was in a family of farmers who hadn't even graduated high school. Like, being able to relate their story, talk about my story, and then talk about the rocket ship of Facebook's rise and how to make sense of all of it was just something that was very, very useful for me in the process, and I hope a useful way to make the topic more accessible to more people. I think one of the key points that I was trying to make in the book is that we often think about luck in this way, where people either really work hard for everything they got, or they win the lottery and get really lucky. And what I was trying to say in the book is that, you know, much more often the case, they're both happening at the same time. I mean, Fortune 500 CEOs are some of the hardest working people out there. They also are getting incredibly lucky, particularly because of the way that we've structured our economy today. And for every one person who's enjoying that, there's another 99 behind it. So being able to tell my own story is sort of a launching point for that. I hope invites new audiences in, and I hope it also does start a little bit more of a frank conversation about how wealth and work in our country are, the connection between the two is becoming increasingly frayed, and I think we need to be more honest about that if we're gonna, you know, think creatively about how to respond to it. So that was a little bit more about my writing process.
And I hope it inspires more blogs to bring this personal storytelling into it, because it really makes the learning easy.
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks for your remarks. I've got a couple of questions. The first is that I understand this idea of a guaranteed income is being tried out experimentally. You referred to Alaska as already having a program like that. I'd be interested in knowing if there's been any systematic study of that and how it's worked out. Second is, the scale you seem to be talking about is national, but what is your thought about whether it would work at a smaller geographic unit like a state or a city?
Yeah. So on the first, and this is a place where I could have written several more chapters in this book about the evidence. There's actually a really robust evidence base for cash domestically. My route to this came actually internationally. I came to cash as an idea after I came into all this wealth. My husband and I were thinking about philanthropy, and specifically, you know, we made a commitment to give away all of our wealth in the course of our lifetime. So, okay, how are we going to do that effectively to get the most bang for the buck? You know, I still want the most impact, and so I have a whole chapter on the international side. But the short answer is there's an immense amount of evidence internationally which shows that dollar for dollar cash is, perhaps counterintuitively or surprisingly, one of the most, if not the most, effective ways to improve health outcomes, education outcomes, general development outcomes. And then specifically in the U.S., there are really four evidence-based sources. The first is up in Alaska. Alaskans get small, but get a guaranteed income every year of $1,500 a person. So if it's a family of four, man, woman, child. So if you have a family of four, you get $6,000, literally direct deposit in October every year. They've started by a Republican governor. It's been going for 40 years. Massively popular. 80% of people up there say it's critical to their own budgeting and to their way of life. They'd prefer to have a new income tax. They don't have an income tax or sales tax. They'd prefer to have an income tax or sales tax put on them than by a 2-to-1 margin than give up the permanent fund dividend. So there's a lot of evidence to show that people stay in the workforce and the money is used responsibly. A second evidence base is that early in the 1970s, we got really close to having a guaranteed income. Richard Nixon supported it. It passed the House, failed in the Senate. And there were 6 studies in as many states, and 10,000 families participated, showed similar things. Labor force participation stayed roughly the same, and there were few of the worried side effects that others showed. Hospitalization rates, things like that went down. The biggest evidence base, though, is really from the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's not a guaranteed income per se, because people don't know exactly how much they're going to get. It only comes one time a year. It depends on what state you live in, how many kids you have, how much money you made. There are all these criteria that go into it. So it's not really very predictable. But there's an immense amount of evidence that shows that after people get those checks, they continue, like I was saying in the talk, continue to work, and that health and education outcomes improve. So there's a good bit of evidence domestically and in 200 plus studies internationally that support the idea. I think in terms of where to start, we should start in a state. I think there's a opportunity for state legislatures to pass the idea, or to even go to the ballot with the idea. So folks have talked about creating a modernized earned income tax credit. It would probably be more modest in size than $500. That's very expensive for state revenue to be able to afford. But there's every reason to believe that we could start in the short term. I do want to say, though, that as much as I really believe in the earned income tax credit as the vehicle to do this, it is not the only way to do a guaranteed income. I don't want folks to leave here thinking that, it's guaranteed income and it has to be through the ITC. There are folks who are working on, like Mike, who are working on other methods. For instance, putting a price on carbon and distributing all of that revenue as a dividend, just as a check. It's the same effect. It could be monthly, it could be annual, cash to help provide financial stability and combat income inequality. But there it's financed in a different way and the method of disbursement would be different. And there are still other ways after that. I'm particularly interested in the ITC because it's been so effective and so popular for so long. But there are plenty of other models out there to do it. And the group that I co-run, we're all about inviting more models in and more ideas because it's going to take as many smart minds as possible focused on figuring this out to actually get to a place where this becomes real policy in the near future.
Hey. So because of your personal story, you have many certain audiences that I think you can especially connect with, and one of them is Silicon Valley people who are especially benefiting from the combination of work and luck that you describe. And I'm just curious kind of how you think about that power center at this moment in American history. Like, what role do they play in the movement that you want to build and the change you want to see? And just more broadly in this political moment, what is, like, you probably have insight into the conversations happening in Silicon Valley about kind of what do we do in this moment. So both like for this project and then more broadly politically. More broadly.
I think, it's hard to talk about Silicon Valley with a single brush, but I'll try, since that was your question. I think a lot of the leaders in Silicon Valley are starting to come to terms with the immense responsibility that they have on so many fronts. I mean, take Facebook as an example. Facebook's role in the election last year is nothing if not controversial and problematic, to say the least. I mean, the fact that Mark has specifically gone out there and said that he has a responsibility and Facebook has a responsibility to make sure that fake news is not moving on the platform. Also to if not break, at least combat the filter bubbles, and certainly make sure that foreign powers are not able to meddle in our elections. I mean, yes, yes, and yes. All of three of those things should be obvious, and I think we all are waiting to see what Facebook will do to combat each one, because the clock is ticking. 2018 is already here. The elections are not far away. So I think that the responsibility that Silicon Valley has, not just to create fun companies that allow us to share cute photos, but really, Facebook is in many ways the civic space now. It is the place where we go to talk about politics and these things. That responsibility, I think, is really deep and profound, and I'm glad that he and Facebook, and I think other technology companies too, are recognizing that. When it comes to the economy, I think there's more work to do. There are Silicon Valley people who talk a lot about a UBI. They usually talk about it more in the context of artificial intelligence and the destruction of jobs. And, that very well may happen. My view is that a guaranteed income solves the problems of today, and we don't need to wait to see. That very well may happen. But I think that there's a responsibility on the leaders themselves to think about what they can do to combat income inequality. And I do think the guaranteed income work that we're doing a demonstration of the idea in Stockton, California, not far from Silicon Valley. So inviting more of those leaders in there to talk to political leaders. I think there's so much more that they can do and should do, and I hope that the book and in general the conversations that you guys and other people have after reading the book help spur those conversations and those calls to really make sure that not just Silicon Valley but people who make up specifically the 1%, the responsibility that they have to make sure that the ladders that they don't that everybody shares in the same kind of economic opportunity that they had. So.
How would you change welfare under UBI, or guaranteed income, as you call it? And on a less important question, were you portrayed in The Social Network, and did you like it if you were?
I'll take the second one first. I was, and it was not a particularly accurate portrayal of me. I watched a lot of TV in the movie. We did not have a TV in our dorm room. So there are all kinds of other things in the movie that you won't be surprised are inaccurate. But yeah, no, I did have this guy Patrick Maple played me. I never met him. But I had a little bit of a role, I guess. In terms of the social safety net, so my view is there's some people out there who want to finance a UBI by cashing in what we have. I think that's fundamentally a mistake. I think particularly in this moment, there's so much to be done to reinforce and support the existing safety net. There are problems with it. I was in Jackson, Mississippi a couple weeks ago working with one of our grantees, talking to women who live in public housing, many of whom are working, but many of whom at different moments have relied on food stamps, unemployment insurance, Medicaid, and they had all kinds of complaints about the way the net works. So I think that there's a conversation to be had, and we should have, about how to improve it. But I don't think that the right approach is just to cash it all in and distribute it as cash. And largely because the numbers on that actually show that it would be redistributive up. It would actually hurt the poorest of the poor disproportionately and help people who are making $40,000 who technically don't count as poor, but I'm fundamentally uncomfortable with that as an idea. So I see these things as really working in tandem with one another, and so having the guaranteed income provides you with that kind of financial stability. But if you're out of work for a period and you need food stamps, you should also be able to access those food stamps until you're back on your feet. So I really see them as being complementary, and that's also why I think in terms of cost, it's very feasible to do this without sacrificing what we have. We have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
In many ways, we find ourselves in a second Gilded Age. A lot of the stats that you cited at the beginning attest to that. And one thing that was critical to escaping the first Gilded Age was the influence of independent politics. And that was that it wasn't enough to push from within the parties, the major parties, the Democrats and Republicans at that time too, to try to achieve landmark legislation like Social Security, like child labor laws, direct election of senators, abolition, women's suffrage. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The New Deal. Independent politics and major progressive third parties that became very threatening to the establishment parties played a very significant role in doing that. And so, just as the logic in business applies, that a monopoly really has no incentive to serve its customers, a monopoly in politics has no incentive to serve its constituents and its voters. And so I wonder, given that independent politics played that critical role in achieving all of those landmark pieces of legislation in our own history, which now we recognize and cherish as kind of the cornerstones of a civilized society even, I wonder what role you think it plays today in the achievement of things like UBI, future landmark achievements.
It's a provocative question. I mean, I think about it more in terms of political leadership rather than political parties. I feel like you might know a little bit more about the role of independent parties. I know some, but my view is that we need political leaders, really, of whatever party, who are willing to get out there and fight for something, even if it isn't immediately poll testing perfectly, to really articulate a certain set of values and to have a North Star, kind of economy that in my view works for everyone rather than the 1%, and to have the confidence to say, yeah, we should raise rates on income above $250,000 up to 50% so that they are in line with historical averages. I mean, that's not something that a lot of Democrats are probably super likely to be excited to say, but frankly, I think it's what we need. So my view is that we need more of that kind of principled leadership in our politics, and the question is where's it going to come from? I mean, I think the next 6 months to a year could be really pivotal on an issue like this one. I mean, there's a simmering interest in guaranteed income and a UBI, and I think it's our job to get out there and ask these questions of the politicians that we want, to for people out there who are interested in the activism to really to push on it, and to also make it make it easier for the leaders to have that leadership and to understand the value of it. So that's a little bit more of the prism that I think about it through, rather than the parties themselves.
Thanks.
Hopefully it's helpful. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming out. I'll be up here signing books, so please come up and introduce yourself. I'd love to say hello.